Taha adopted the fundamental position that if a system is diseased, there can be no successful palliative that epistemologically derives from the same system that causes the disease. So in other words, we cannot remedy modernity with things that are assumed to be an integral part of modernity. The palliatives, then, must always hail from a qualitatively different pedigree than the one generating both the disease and perhaps even its etiology. Etiology is being the diagnostics, the description of the problem. I'm using here some medical terms because we live in a pathology. And in fact, interestingly enough, I think many people seem to find this appealing. And I don't wonder why. And depending on a wide array of French and other European critics, for example, Habermas, Ellul, Jonas, and others, Taha clearly accepts, at least partly, certain forms of modern etiologies. But when he comes to offer solutions, he initiates a radical departure from these thinkers. I say partly because Taha's etiology refuses to frame itself within the secular, resorting in the end to a psychoepistemology anchored in a narrative of man's createdness within and dependence on a world of interconnections and unity. Deriving from and building on Taha's theorization of the subject, I argue that we can speak of particular qualities that characterize the new concept of the human. These, and by the way, here when I speak about the new human, I want to connect this with what I did on Orientalism. I said the Orientalism needs to be rehabilitated and changed fundamentally, structurally. And so the new person inhabiting Orientalism should also be subject to these generalizations that I'm going to be discussing now. These characteristics of the new human are to be distinguished from the techniques that are indispensable for forming this new human. The characteristics are the minimal essentials that make such a human new. And as an antidote to the modern malaise, each of these characteristics are deemed essential because each performs, along with the others, a particular task, the totality of which make up the condition of a sufficient palliative. Now, taking for granted that every subject must be located within and formed by one type of habitus or another, as we discussed yesterday, a new concept of the human will be said to enjoy, in light of modernity's specific crisis, a number of characteristics, all of which are interrelated and constitute a single interconnected whole. The idea of interconnection is going to be very important now. A point of entry to this whole is the characteristic of anti-materialism, generally defined as a critical and systematic transgression against divination of the material world, where matter, including the human as materially conceived, has been endowed with the highest value. Materialism is therefore not just a physically disposed attitude to the world, but also, and in fact primarily, a metaphysical conception of material reality as one of brute, inert, and stupid matter. And these words, by the way, are Robert Boyle's words, not mine, the famous mechanical philosopher. This metaphysics also rests on a potent conception of instrumentalism that systemically makes a habit of confusing ends with means, converting the former into the latter and rendering the modern telos an ever unattainable desideratum. The anti-materialists, by contrast, recognize higher principles as ever binding, precisely because these principles are not subject to this discretion and whim of materialism. This is not to say that materiality should or can be abolished from the world, for the world is, after all, made of matter. But the world is obviously not just matter, nor is it just the total sum of all of its parts. nor does matter signify, in this conception, the brute and the stupid. Whether at the spiritual, metaphysical level or material, physical plane, sentient and insentient life lives in and with matter. Yet this is only one of the grounds of existence in an infinitely more complex universe of forces and spirits. The anti-materialist, therefore, recognizes that in this complex existence, materialism is no more than a means to an end. Matter is always subservient, yet still integral to a higher order of existence that is made of first-order ethical principles. This much is readily available, is very readily derivable from Taha's thought. An anti-materialist conception would thus shun capitalism along with its modus vivendi and modus operandi, namely the corporation, multinational or otherwise. It would also shun the political structures that are installed to make materialism and capitalism possible and hegemonically operative, which is also to say that capitalism as a performative metaphysics would be rejected on principle, however painful this may sound. Insofar as I know, Taha does not attend to these materialist forms, although he has much to say rather indirectly about their social and philosophical implications. Like colonialism, capitalism in his work is not so far an integral philosophical unit of critical analysis. If we are to keep in mind the immediate effects of modernity's malaise, then an anti-materialist critic must uphold, as a matter of principle, a systematic resistance to modern forms of capitalism. For capitalism as a metaphysics and pervasive and dominating attitude, not just as an economic form, constitutes the full effect of materialism. So what I'm saying is that capitalism is not just the economics of it. Capitalism is subjectivity forming thing. It is psychological, social, and political, and so many other things at the same time. This is why all of it I call materialism together. So materialism is a bigger circle in which a smaller circle sits called capitalism. An irrational greed. Capitalism was integral to the rise of an instrumentalized materialist outlook on the world, and simultaneously concomitant with the effects generated by the materialist attitudes in the world. The new concept of the human also presupposes a subjectivity that is characterized by a categorical absence and total negation of sovereignty. This is the second characteristic. But this is not to suggest that sovereignty is substantively separable from materialism, for both go hand in hand. I have dwelt on the concept of Orientalism as an arena of thought that exhibits the same genetic features that structurally constitute nearly the entire range of modern knowledge we have come to subsume under the various academic disciplines. In this story, the rise of a new, unprecedented form of human sovereignty marks a commensurate rupture in human history, one that ushered in unique forms of colonialism, hegemony, and destruction. This is to say that the unbounded materialism of modernity and its subject must be seen as ontologically subordinate to, though inseparable from, sovereignty. For it was this latter, sovereignty, that gave rise to the love of mastery and control, the prerequisite for materialism. If this is clear, then it is not sufficient for a new concept of the human to entertain or settle for the resisting subject, the subversive agent who refuses who we are, what we are. Remember the discussion yesterday. To become performative, refusal must embody itself in a normative substrate, a substructure of thought, action, and feeling that systematically and systemically embed resistance and refusal in a habituated psycho-epistemology of humility and modesty. 3. Taha's chosen term for this is haya, which is a huge term for him. I don't use all of its meanings, I just use one here, pertinent to my project. a philosophical concept of variegated and intertwined meanings. I take haya to include, in the most profound of ways, the concept and feeling of gratitude, without which no modesty before or respect of anything is ever possible. If refusal and resistance are negative approaches, then humility, modesty, and gratitude are the positive, non-defensive, and self-confident ways of being in the world. Being in the world. A new concept of the human thus generates a subject who does not recognize human sovereignty and one who cannot conceive of herself as being sovereign. Here, the Kantian trio of free rational will, freedom, willing, and rationality, has no place in the architecture of the new subject. Look at the difference now between Kant and what I'm talking about. This subject who perceives herself as devoid of the impulse to mastery and the quest for power. It is my argument then that resistance and refusal are insufficient for producing the new concept of the human I'm trying to outline here. What is needed instead is a new habitus, and more precisely, a new form of embodiment and ethical cultivation that permit no place either for the love of mastery and domination or for the very cognition of these forms of sovereignty. The very cognition of the sovereignty. Because if you once conceive it, can imagine it, you are in trouble already. A new concept of the human thus demands new forms of acculturation, education and upbringing. The forms in this new configuration take it for granted that the subject is formed by humility, modesty, and gratitude, all of which are not mere nouns and derivative descriptors, but effectively performative as technologies of the self, which I think you are by now tired of hearing of. But you have to. They are not, in yet other words, mere qualities that we may preach for or admire, but they rather stand as constitutive of a world of values in which the subject is born and nurtured, systematically, systemically, and constitutionally. Humility is never timidity or meekness, nor is it servility or obsequiousness. It is, like modesty, a world in which pride and vanity have no place. They must be suppressed and kept at bay, just like we do with things like dishonesty and cunning and such things. If modesty is unpretentiousness, moderation, and simplicity, then gratitude is appreciation, thankfulness, and a deep feeling of indebtedness. Haya is therefore not only the antidote to sovereignty and arrogance, those qualities that define the modern subject. It is in effect a new habitus, a performative technology, and an uncompromised way of living in the world, not living above it. Nor is living in the world, not living above it, just a virtuous quality that makes for a merely desirable way of experiencing the world. Living in the world, our fourth characteristic, is nothing short of a psychoepistemology that dictates how one qualitatively lives, how one lives the full meaning of life, lives the meaning of living in the world. A new concept of the human recognizes the world as a unity, where all things, sentient and insentient, stand in an interconnected whole. Such a concept recognizes the intrinsic value of things, just because they exist like us. It's enough for them to exist, that's it. This, again, is not just an outlook on the world, one that can be adopted from one external remove or another. Rather, it is an inner, formative conception of reality, a view from within, an outlook integral to and internally embedded in a conception of the world as one formed by interconnections and continuity. After all, it's one of the most baffling things when I heard it first, that the meteorites that they find on Earth are made of the same matter that we are made of. This alone, just this scientific fact alone, wrought havoc with my mind when I first heard it, something like probably 20 years ago. To say that the world is continuous is to conceive of a fabric of being that makes everything one does, every omission and commission, relevant, and thus effectual to everything else. Every, not only commission, every omission relevant. What you don't do is sometimes more important than what you do. And as I always say, silences are more expressive than actual utterances. It is also to say that because this living in the world is a psychoepistemology, continuousness and continuity are substantively made of an ethical fiber, endowed with an epistemology and ontology of responsibility. This is because there is no act, no speech, that can escape this cycle of continuity, this cycle of interconnection. In other words, whatever one does or says, or does not say or do, has an effect on something, ad seriatim, around it, both conceptually and existentially. And if ethics is the way in which we speak of a genuine concept of responsibility, then everything that is said, done, or altogether omitted is inevitably engulfed and judged by this ethics. Responsibility then cannot be grounded in a rhetoric whose foundations are laid by anthropocentrism or secular humanism, for these have proven incapable of a genuine solution to many of the problems generated precisely because of them. Responsibility is not just speech and theory and knowledge, nor is it just actionable procedure. Responsibility is praxis. Not practice, it's praxis. A habituation, psychoepistemology, and a habitus all at once. This is the meaning of the obliteration of any qualitative distinction between theory and theoretical knowledge, on the one hand, and praxis, on the other. If the world is an interconnected whole, then it is impossible to escape the dialectic between the two. To speak of theoretical knowledge as the prerequisite for praxis is to navigate at the surface. It is effectively to create a disjuncture between the two. For as long as praxis is made to stand in a relationship of consequential concurrence with theory, praxis would never be able to keep up with its theoretical antecedents. The differential is not just a matter of quality or quantity, a matter of quantity. Rather, it represents a qualitative disparity between ideal talk, as in culture talk, and the techniques of praxis that remain disconnected from ideas and speech. And because of the disjuncture between the two, praxis as an ethical cultivation is precisely that which suffers. It is one of Taha's fundamental premises that the very act of engagement in praxis is a psychoepistemically productive process. For praxis itself deepens the psychoepistemic experience, increasing it both quantitatively and qualitatively. Inasmuch as theory is necessary for engagement in praxis, this latter is dialectically productive of theoretical knowledge. So ilm and amal are really not to be separated from each other. They are just two names for the same thing from different point of views. To be distinguished from generic practice, thick practice, that's Taha's work, al-amal al-thaqil, he calls it, al-amal al-thaqil, is always ethical because it ensues from an equally thick knowledge. That which has been generated by the process of enhanced reason, which I translate as ethical reason. The dialectical interaction and therefore unity of theory and practice is then the fifth characteristic of this concept of the human. And this also, all of this, by the way, pertains again to the issue of Orientalism. It is done in another book, but the books are interrelated in the sense that for somebody to become a true scholar, it's not enough just simply to have a theory and practice. They have to have praxis, where the theory and praxis coincide and meet each other. The concept that all things in the world are interconnected bears the burden of the ethical responsibility of stewardship. Nor are humility and gratitude just states of consciousness. They are so crucial precisely because the human species is both burdened and privileged by the duty of trusteeship and stewardship, both of which translate into care of the world. The care of the world is as much needed as the care of the self. That's something which we always, now we are talking about the care of the self, whenever Foucault made it popular, but nobody is talking about care of the world. I don't know of a single book really that's called Care of the World as a philosophical discipline equivalent to the care of the self. I think both of them should be together. That's this is actually, to be honest with you, it's a new idea that I'm now developing, but it is something that to be taken seriously. To be a steward is to live in a world that is psychoepistemically saturated with humility and gratitude. It is to live in a world that does not know, much less recognize, mastery and love of domination. This absence is in fact a productive presence, for there is no empty space left by the unknowability of mastery. The space is rather an already full mental landscape that understands the necessity and implications of what it means to be a created thing. This is the link missed by the otherwise meritorious contributions of people like Jonas and probably Habermas a little. The very appreciation of the meaning of createdness, of man's contingency, ephemerality, death, and ultimate insignificance is precisely the necessary link, the necessary thick link that Jonas and others like him have overlooked. But as creatures of the secularized liberal habit, they have also missed the significance of praxis and psychoepistemology in ethical habituation. Jonas's fear, and Taha does engage Jonas quite significantly. Jonas's fear, concept of fear, which says that we will fix the environment issue and we will manage to fix all our problems, because if we don't, we are going to all of us die. Because we fear dying, we will fix things. That's the poorest excuse for fixing things. And this is why I think it is not enough to go that path. And that's where Taha and I work on the same set of assumptions. Jonas's fear can never on its own accomplish much. It is for the most part unproductive. When the subject engages a praxis of ethical formation, she effectively engages a set of signifiers that bring together the communal and divine good as a unified world of reference. It is to understand the full meaning of the summum bonum, which is to say that the good is not a constrained notion of human welfare, but one that brings the individual, the community, and God into one interconnected whole. For Taha, the trio, man, community, God, is defined in Islamic terms, but terms that enter into a never-ceasing dialogue with the world that surrounds what he wants to see. I think somewhat problematically as an Islamic modernity. Yet the substantive contents of the trio and the praxis entailed in generating the necessary habitus and technologies of ethical formation are there for humanity at large to digest and implement, with the distinctive adage, each to his own. If Islam, like all traditional or secular religions, and there are many secular religions, arrogates to itself an especially ethical place in the world, it also insists that God created, quote unquote, for each nation, community, ummah, a moral law and a way of life. But there is no escaping the qualitative construction of the trio, which must obtain if humanity were to truly exit what he calls the ills of the Western application of modernity, afat. That Taha may have exaggerated the qualitative difference between spirit and application is a matter that I've discussed. That the solution resides in the desperate need for a new concept of the human is not only testimonial to the irreparable crisis of modernity, but also to the bankruptcy of the very structure of modernity's ethical and epistemic constitution. The ultimate challenge to both Taha and his interlocutors then resides in the last part of the trio, which is to say that the entire problem squarely rests not only on the place of the human on earth, but more fundamentally on the relationship of the human to his ontological surroundings. For it is this relationship, with all its implications and effects, that will determine the quality of the subject, the quality of not just who we are, but what must we become. As I have argued in the context of what I take to be the crisis of modern knowledge, the secular grounding of humility and gratitude will always fall short of a meaningful and effective solution to the problem at hand. Secular modernity is thus, by definition, anti-transcendentalist. My translation of the idea that the true human is one who subsumes himself or herself in the created and enchanted world. Ex-transcendentalism, which is its opposite, where the gods are dragged down to the earth and where the created beings become lords of the creator, subverting really basically sovereignty. This latter remains the rule of the day, with modernity's stubborn refusal to acknowledge its own complicity in a destructive form of transcendentalism. On the other hand, Taha is as stubborn in his insistence that current modernity's bankruptcy is caused precisely by the severance of the paradigmatic link between the human and the higher powers that gave this human his raison d'etre. Powers that have been in existence long before him and that will continue after he is gone. Humility and gratitude cannot have a genuine transformative power in modulating the new subject without this recognition. The issue then is never just a matter of faith, religion, or secularism, but rather nothing short of a constitutive epistemology of how we conceive of the world, how we treat it, how we treat our own kind and those others, making our own environment that seem to vanish from existence faster than ever. This knowledge, this decent, humble epistemology is what makes us one kind of a human rather than another. Thank you.
Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillah. There's so much to reflect on here, and such wonderful people in this room and online that I want to hear from, so I'm going to make it brief. And in case I don't get a chance to thank all of you for being here, for your trust that I will, well, you're here for Professor Hallaq, but thank you for being here, and for Professor Timothy Jannati, honorary professor. No. Mizan al-Mulk. He loves that name, and I love to give that name to him. MashaAllah. So that your trust that, and Andrew Busso, our friend, that I will be an appropriate interlocutor for Professor Hallaq, presumptuous as it was. Nevertheless, I was humbled by it, and I thank you very much for it and for having me in such august company. My dear, lovely wife, who knows me and knew how nervous I was sitting next to Hallaq, that I couldn't sleep for a few nights before, sent me with two bottles of sleeping pills, different kind, because she says, I know what you do when you start thinking, you don't sleep.
Which she tried to give me.
I try to give those pills to him so he'll have less to say. But then he checked with his dear wife, who said she couldn't trust just any random person, right? She has to. She had to. So anyway, much gratitude to both of our wives, because of whom we couldn't do what we were doing. So I'll now to my brief comments. I am in deep sympathy with Professor Hallaq's project of the new human being. I believe that in much of what he says, and even the terms that he is using, if not even the phraseology one is reminded of many of the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. Of course, haya is, as he says, is a characteristic of this ummah. And in one beautiful tradition, the Prophet ﷺ hears somebody being reminded of haya, and somebody said to them, "Don't be too shy. There's too much haya in you." And the Prophet said, "Stop that. There is no such thing as too much haya." And then, so this is it's a beautiful reminder on theory and praxis as well. It reminded me of the Quranic verse, "Ittaqullah wa yu'allimukumullah." Fear Allah and Allah will teach you. And one way to understand that is that you practice your taqwa, practice the knowledge and awareness of God that you have, and God will teach you. And there is a hadith, "Man amila bima ya'mal bima ya'lam amila yu'allimuhu Allah ma la ya'lam." Whoever practices what they know, God teaches them what they don't know through praxis. To borrow Professor Hallaq's word, this is a weak hadith, nevertheless, its meaning is confirmed otherwise. And so there's so much here to reflect on, and that I didn't have really the time I don't have the time to comment on. I do want to suggest a few things for both Professor Hallaq and the audience here to think about going forward. One is our relationship to the world, being in the world. Of course, does this remind anyone of being in the world, not of it? Right? And what does that mean, being in the world and not of it? In other words, the other half, this is sort of a Christian saying, but of course, as Muslims, we are reminded of the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, "Kun fi dunya ka'annaka gharib aw 'abir sabil." Be in the world as if you are a stranger or someone passing by. Yet at the same time, the attitude that Professor Hallaq mentions is reflected in the other hadith of the Prophet, which says that if the day of judgment comes and you have a seedling planted, فَلْيَغْرِسْهَا, that you must care for the world even if the day of judgment has come. And so I think that these two attitudes, right, they go hand in hand together in our tradition. That on the one hand, we are a stranger in the world in the sense that we don't invest everything in it. Rather, to use another metaphor, we look at this world in the peripheral view as we are driving toward God, right? The things that are passing by. Because if you begin to focus on this world, there isn't enough of this world for all of us. And that, to some degree, is what modernity has failed in appreciating. That human desire, and to use a Christian philosopher, to immanentize the eschaton, to bring the heaven on this earth, because you don't believe in heaven, in Jannah, in Jahannam anymore. You want to bring the paradise for yourself and heaven and hell for others in this world. And that effectively, this is Eric Vogelin, Protestant philosopher, but effectively this is what modernity, what we have done. And to remember that we are only a stranger, with strangers, is an important reminder to put a limit on our otherwise limitless ambition. The limitless ambition that human beings have that other animals don't, that makes modernity, that makes us who we are, is in fact ambition for God, aspiration for God. But we misidentify it as simply we want infinitude in this world. And I believe that that's a reflection that concurs with many of the reflections of Professor Hallaq. I will make 3 points, I guess, further that are of somewhat critical bent, but they're really more questions than critiques, because I haven't fully understood and appreciated the points that I've heard today. First, there is in the structural critique, whether that emerges in the 19th century Europe, and certainly one sees that in Marx, one sees that in Foucault, one sees that in Nietzsche, there is a deep cynicism toward the world, toward human reason, toward human nature. Whereas in Islamic tradition, there is, I see, great optimism toward human nature. Fitra, for example, is something that is immediately accessible to us. No matter what institutions have corrupted us, you scratch the surface and you find people who are willing to leave this extremely, Foucauldian biopower where every impulse, it would seem, has been curated to become homo economicus, where we have become as if slaves of modernity, and you present the truth to these people and they are, they're dying to leave it, right? Despite all that. In other words, I think that Foucault, from Marx to Foucault, there is the absence, despite very compelling critique, there is the absence of optimism that comes from, as I said yesterday, from completing the Surah Al-Asr that you start. إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ وَإِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. There is very immediate relief in going back to the fitrah, and philosophically I see that as access to the good that all human beings have, even despite all these structures that are working against us. And so it's simply to say that I think there needs to be greater optimism and hope. In other words, our theory of human fall should be balanced with a theory of human fitrah that is seeking God. Second point is on theory and praxis. Well, on the one hand, I completely agree with Professor Hallaq's really close connection between theory and praxis, but that precisely, I think, is the reason why we should, when, for example, we talk about political ethics, we cannot separate philosophical politics, from one's practice. And that's the point I was trying to make about Professor Abdurrahman Taha, if I understand Taha correctly, which is not to say that, I do, is simply the secondary literature. Nevertheless, the point I'm trying to make, theoretically, is that the Muslims have always valued people, the Imams of Muslims, whether Abu Hanifa or Shafi'i or Rabbi Ahmad bin Hanbal or Ghazali bin Taymiyyah, people who's not because their analyses were brilliant, but because they reflected, their praxis convinced people that they, in fact, are practicing what they're teaching. And I think that is something that really is important. It's important because our philosophy, Islamic philosophy, the alternative to modernity, mustn't make the same mistake of separating these criteria of evaluation, from practice and conduct. Whether I'm evaluating Taha Abdurrahman correctly, that's a completely separate issue, and I can acknowledge that I know very little about about Moroccan context. And finally, and this is merely a just choice of words, Professor Hallaq likes to use the word enchantment, so sort of modernity has disenchanted the world, and we want to re-enchant it. And I think that, so of course the use of the word enchantment goes back to Max Weber's famous description of the world as being disenchanted by modernity, and by disenchantment he means that people don't believe in supernatural forces and in magic, black magic, and all of these things anymore. People believe rather in rational science, and the heaven is no longer filled with demons and angels and so on, but rather heaven is an empty space right now that we simply explore with our science. But I think that enchantment, disenchantment narrative that Max Weber has given us is fundamentally, I think it's unfit to describe what's really going on. In other words, this was Max Weber's own experience. First of all, he talked about two enchantments. To him, monotheism itself, starting with Christianity and then Islam, were first movements of enchantment. So disenchantment, there were two disenchantments. The first disenchantment was monotheism, because monotheism pushed back against Roman and Greek paganism, animism, or wherever these religions went. And so to him, this world was already disenchanted, and then final disenchantment came from, so he saw that as part of progress. Monotheism was progress over paganism, and then secular atheism is a progress vis-a-vis monotheism. Obviously, I think that this is a problematic narrative, one for many reasons, and their modern scholarship shows, in fact, even about Max Weber himself, he was very interested in the occult, in black magic, and people around him. And in fact, as people left monotheism, even Christianity, they in fact become more interested in the occult. And modern research shows that, in fact, as religious belief goes down and atheism goes up, the interest in the occult in those societies goes up. And today it is at this peak. This relationship that Max Weber creates between enchantment and disenchantment is utterly mistaken on several grounds. And I think that if what we mean to say by bringing back enchantment is that we need to believe in God, we need to believe in God's agents, we need to believe in barakah, we need to believe in something beyond this matter. Perhaps we need a different set of words to describe that. But apart from that, I am, as I said, I'm extremely honored to have been in this company, and I'm looking forward to the rest of your questions.
Thank you very much. Before we start Question City, we've got only half an hour,
yes.
And we have so many questions online, and I wish we could delay your flight.
No, but Professor Anjum will answer them very quickly.
So, City,
just very quickly, I don't understand what's new about this new human. It sounds to me as if it's a restorative project. It's a renewal, perhaps, but not new. So I'm wondering just about your choice of words there.
Yeah, it is restorative in so many ways. Yeah, but that human, and this is where I can pick on the idea of enchantment and disenchantment, is that a human is new because he doesn't exist anymore. So it's restorative. Okay, fine, I'll take it. But restorative of something that doesn't exist. It's not like you have something that you are fixing. You need to create a totally new subjectivity, because none of these the qualities that I have described, exists paradigmatically in the modern subject. Even if we theoretically say some people see the world as interconnected, this is knocked down by the fact that I wanted to say something about because the five attributes I described must also come together to constitute the subject. You cannot have one without the other. So if you believe in interconnections, you should believe also in modesty and humility and so forth and so on. And you should believe in anti-materialism, etc., etc. So all of these are not things that existed in necessarily all of them in the same form before the dawn of modernity. For example, we didn't have a notion of materialism anywhere, anytime in human history. Yeah? Yes, but this is I started the issue of interconnections because I wanted to tie it to the idea of this disenchanted world. If somebody must see the world as interconnected, it's not enough to see it as interconnected and not also see the idea that we need re-enchantment. But re-enchantment here, I see it differently. I think you bestow on Weber a bit of a narrow definition of what he meant by disenchantment. I think he meant by it also, he was writing in this trajectory or sequence that started way before him, and especially Nietzsche would have defined for Foucault, for Weber and others, defined the concept of disenchantment that includes also God and everything else. It is not just about black magic and demons, etc. Disenchantment is one side of anthropocentrism. Disenchantment is to say that humans are the locus of power and authority and sovereignty now. When in fact, before that, God was. And so if you either abolish God or relegate him, because you can abolish him by becoming an atheist, or you can relegate him by becoming a deist. A deist was one who would say, well, God is there, he created the world, ran it according to a certain logic because he created the world in a very intelligent way, and he just simply closed the door behind him and disappeared from the scene. Now the world runs on its own, which means that it runs on its own and we are part of this running, which means we can run it. Yeah. So deism was actually the stage between Catholicism or religion, including even the Reformation, and what we come to see later as atheism, but also secularism. And so it's not just disenchantment is reversing the order of the world in terms of who is sovereign. Really, it's not about magic. I think it is true what you said, absolutely. But it is the picture is much larger. It's actually a holistic picture. It's about disenchantment is describing a new cosmology. So it is new in some ways, to answer your question, but not new in some ways, but new in some other ways. Because now we have a challenge of creating a subject after 200 years almost of capitalism wreaking havoc on us.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to quickly take the questions from the floor, and we've got about 20 questions online, so it's going crazy. So I'll take Rashid, then Mufti Saleh, and so what's your name? Anas, and then Dr. Mahin, and then we'll take, and if there's anybody left on the physically on the floor, then we'll just take I'll take a summary of the online one. So Rashid, please, yeah.
Hi, Aslan. Thank you for a wonderful weekend. My question had to do with this idea that you spoke about anti-materialism, and this commitment to interconnectedness as a kind of performative technology by which one can be habituated and to become shaped as the Khalifa on the world. Now, given this, I think my question here is, what does Abdurrahman Taha or yourself or Dr. Anjum, what do you guys think about Akbarian ontology, in which the essence of something, or the wujud of something, is not material, it's actually khayali, or it's mumkin, and if he is a Sufi, as he claims to be, Ibn Arabi's influence upon Sufism is undeniable, and I don't know where he places that in his thought, and what role it plays, if any. So I was curious about that, and then just to continue on from there, I've always been interested in this subject because I feel at the turn of the century, around that time, as Muslims are shaking off and dealing with the colonial legacy and moving towards independence, you had a number of thinkers that looked at the Akbarian impulse as kind of, and they blamed it in many ways for the inhitat, for the decline of Muslim civilization. So you have Sheikh al-Islam Mustafa Sabri wrote Mawqif al-Aql, and he goes to town at Ibn Arabi in that book, and you have Iqbal mentioning Persian influence on Sufism, I think is what he calls it, Abdul Wahab, many Islamist thinkers, and we can go on. There seems to be, even amongst all these groups that I just mentioned, they disagree with one another vehemently, but they have this common target in this kind of monist ontology, which they blame for kind of decline, that it engendered fatalism, or it results in an absurdity or a collapse between the Hallaq and the makhluk. And so I guess what I'm asking is for your thoughts as to the relationship and in what's the role for ontology as we conceive this new human being. What is his haqiqah? What is his essence? And how important is this conversation, and even an important conversation to have today, as a path forward to engendering this new habitus towards engendering a re-enchantment? That's the question that I want to ask. Thanks.
Thank you. Should we take a few more questions, or do you want to answer one at a time?
Maybe
So,
yeah, thank you so much. This is perhaps more a social question. So I have studied Iqbal, especially Persian, for the past 10 years, and I always felt like he was grasping something but didn't really get it. And when I read Taha, it was like everything that I felt like Iqbal had, I wish he had written, whether in Persian, Urdu, or English, that Taha had taken it far beyond anything that I could have ever imagined with Iqbal, you know. And obviously, as a South Asian Muslim, that was really, really important to me. But this is more of a question that, you know, from the time that the British came into Mughal India and took the Divan from Shah Alam II in 1765 until now, I haven't read anybody like Taha, from Morocco to India, from West Africa to India.
Me too.
You know, whether that's Maulana Qasim al-Nadawi in Urdu, or, you know, or Mustafa Sabri in Arabic, or Sa'id Nursi in Turkish. And I studied these languages just so I could see Muslims in modernity well, and, you know, Taha is just has really surpassed anyone, and, you know, truly his closest thinker, Shah Waliullah, I would really, really argue, and, you know, that dissertation, you know, definitely needs to be written between Badur al-Bazigha and all his entire oeuvre, and inshallah someone will write that who knows his Arabic and Persian. So I want to ask you, is that why has it taken 250 years for Muslims to produce? And I know I'm fangirling in our way to Taha, and please, inshallah, ismah li, that why has it taken for 200 years of Muslims who have gone to, you know, Cambridge or Harvard or Yale or Sorbonne in Paris, and all of them have been, you know, enchanted, you know, instead by the world, they've been enchanted by modernity. And, you know, and obviously probably the only other person that was really not was Iqbal, but, you know, he probably didn't have the same grasp on the tradition that Taha did, and that's probably my thing. But I would say that Muhammad al-Jabri, who comes from Wajda on the border of Algeria and Morocco, you know, when he goes and studies, why doesn't he have that same thing? Or why doesn't, you know, Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan, when he comes to Oxford, or Muhammad Abdu or Jamal ibn Afghani, why has it taken 250 years to produce someone like Taha? And considering our tradition, but yeah, sorry.
Anas?
It's a completely different question from what he. So I think.
Okay.
Sure. I think that we should just collect all the questions.
Yeah,
there isn't going back.
Yeah.
I was going to ask about the new human, and both you and Taha repudiate, or at the very least minimize, violence in the formation of this new human. And I'm not advocating violence. I'm only asking a question. What I want to ask here is that you and Taha, acknowledge that modernity is not going to reform itself. And that the actors in this modern play have not only been willing, but capable of inflicting brutal and excessive violence to accomplish their ends, to stop you in your project. And so I wonder, and I think this ties into sort of where I am, yes, the modern subject here is defending himself. The reason why I want the bad guy in the room is because at least he sees me as necessary for his goals. He's giving me another 40 minutes to think about how to get out of this problem. The good guy is making me commit suicide. Because the bad guy is willing to has not only the modes of inflicting violence, but the willingness and the capability of inflicting it. And I need 40 minutes to think. So, وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ لَا تُكَلَّفُ إِلَّا نَفْسَكَ وَحَرِّضِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ عَلَى الْقِتَالِ. Fight in the way of God. You're only responsible for what you're capable of doing. But instill and inculcate values of bravery and selflessness so that others can fight for God. Either Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and many others are shuhada, are testimony in their very essences to the truth and vitality of the path of God, or they're suckers. They're suckers who died for myth and superstition, and I should just stick with the strong guy. So I'm wondering in this, and this is honestly my belief, is that unless the new human has a way of dealing with violence, and with all due respect, I feel like in your epilogue you didn't deal with this as much as I would have hoped you to do, then I have to stick with the bad guy in the room. Because at least he thinks my existence is pertinent to his existence. And like I said before, I need that 40 minutes to think.
Thank you. And the final question, Dr.
Oh my God, how do I follow that one? Well,
Sorry.
No, thank you. Very interesting. What a terrific conversation. My observation is fairly simple and just request a comment. I'm at the University of Notre Dame, at the Keough School of Global Affairs. It's a new school, and the concept that animates our whole school is called integral human development. It comes from Catholic social teachings and papal encyclicals, and Pope Francis recently developed this idea in Laudato Si, the idea of care for our common home, which was the care for the self and then the care for the home. But he integrates in that deeply, the cultivation of a kind of subjectivity, obviously rooted in Catholic teachings, with virtues of humility, but also, deeply diagnosing some of the problems of modernity. And then speaking of things like integral ecologies, where it's both integral with the human nature, but also within society. So I articulate that because it resonates deeply with what I feel like I'm hearing from you. And so, in your studies, do you find, or have you found, this kind of resonance? Do you think an interreligious kind of conversation on these, how valuable is that? And then I guess that goes to the question of pluralism, where if there are pluralistic conceptions of moral subject formation, how is that to be mediated in a kind of sulta, which will be maybe competed that position, since it's the executive is influenced by this subjective formations in society. How will we mediate, who captures that that position, perhaps? And that's not very articulate, but you get the idea.
Fantastic. So if we have quick responses, and then...
Then we take online questions.
Online is about 30 questions now. And they're all back. They're like essays.
I think it's unfair not to take their questions, right?
Okay, so I'll try and summarize as much as I can from the online ones. So, first one here, they're repetitive. Okay, so here's an interesting one. Could I ask Professor Hallaq on what is the projected view on how long will the modern state last for with current socio-economic difficulties for the mass, except few? How long will the world tolerate it? How long will the world take to start moving against such a globalized modern world? Appreciate Dr. Hallaq's approach towards changing the rules of the game. His next work is on defining the subject that can bring about this change. Where does he think he's presently in the project of finding the rules of the game? Should we expect the new subject will come up with a method in due course? What type of institutional approach does he see forcefully to bring about the vision to life from an activism perspective? Is the production of the subject a subjectivity of the paramount? Each system, as a result of its values, produces certain types of subjects. The leaders are the reflection and the representation of the people of its society. As I understand, all prophets, peace be upon them, were concerned about reforming people from bottom up. Hence, Sufism is absolutely spot on reforming humanity and its current predicament. In somewhat surprise that the program for action ultimately is no different from the plethora of Islamist movements that have sprung up in the last century. There's nothing unique at all except for highbrow philosophical engagement that too few Muslims are actually going to be interested in. It's therefore perhaps fair to say Taha Abdurrahman in the long run will probably be to go in the way of Mu'tazila, of the old, interesting, maybe unconventional ideas, pious adherents. I know who this person is.
This is one person.
It's just yeah.
You said you know who this group is.
Yeah. So, good friend. And finally, could I ask a more defined explanation of what Hallaq said about the two levels of politics earlier in the speech? One superficial, another more deep, is affecting our life structure, and the latter is what matters mostly currently. Also, how did Professor Hallaq come to see that the Hanafi madhab is more of a moral madhab, if I understand him correctly? The other He's a Hanafi.
You said Hanafi is the least ethical.
No, I didn't say that. I said it's not about ethical, not ethical, about the degree of leaning on ethics among the madhabs. And the Hanbalis are, and one can show this. It needs a few books, but one will be good, but nobody has it. But it's there. If you study the fiqh, you can see it very easily. It's not a distinguishing. I don't have anything against the Hanafi madhab or anything.
Okay, so we've got the floor of questions and responses.
Take some.
Okay, so I guess I'll go as quickly as I can. That's what I do. So Rashid's question on Ibn Arabi. So I happen to agree with the last 250 years of analysis of Ibn Arabi, which has been complex, not as simple as super rejection. But yes, I do chalk him up to Neoplatonic influence on Islam, which is not to say that it was all bad, but nevertheless, there is plenty of historical evidence that late medieval Sufism wreaked havoc on Muslim societies and morally, ethically, which is not to condemn Sufism per se, but late medieval ethical tasawwuf does, in fact, lead to many challenges. And in fact, this is something that Ahmad Sarhandi recognized, which is precisely why he pushed back against Ibn Arabi, and Shah Waliullah tried to reconcile Ibn Arabi with the Sunnah and so on and so forth. So that's a complex history, and I don't think we can reduce it to saying that they all rejected or simply rejected Ibn Arabi without reason. Saleh, to your question, I guess I'll have my take, but I think your question is really directed to Professor Hallaq. My take is that I think, with all due respect and love, it is you're unfair to, again, 250 years of Muslim scholarship. There is really a lot more, in my view, a lot more than Taha, a lot more brilliant than Taha, but we need Taha, right? Which is not to say, the way you think of scholarship, and if I could make a plea to people, stop thinking of scholarship as one brilliant star who will solve all problems. Scholarship is done in communities, it's done with generations arguing with each other, and I think that sort of has happened. I myself find that whether I look at South Asia or the Arab world, and you look at Muslims arguing with each other, often people you don't know well, because they're not the superstar scholars supported by the state, and you find deep wisdom and address many of these solutions that we're talking about. I think we need to appreciate that has been happening, and have the humility, which is not to say you don't have, mashallah, your conduct shows you have much more than I do, but that humility that, Muslims have, other living Muslims, not just the Muslims dead 500 years ago, living Muslims also may be better than us and smarter than us, and that they're worthy of doing, they're doing something we don't know. On Anas's question, I would say, again, your question is really for Professor Hallaq, but I tend to sympathize with your problematique, your question. I think the way you ask it is somewhat provocative, but I think the question is valid, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much.
Well, I would say, in terms of Ibn Arabi, that we do not have, and also commenting on your comment to his comment, we don't have to take the entire beast, either in entirety or nothing. We can be selective. History can never be revived, because ma fata mat. History is dead. We cannot really bring it back in terms of institutions, because it has an ecology, social ecology, whatever, intellectual ecology that cannot be recreated. We are not gods. We cannot perform these miracles. These are miracles. What we can do is use history as an exemplar to take the best out of it. So, for example, I wouldn't have to deal with, whatever Sufism emphasized in terms of miracles and superstition. It worked in the old days, good for them, but it doesn't work nowadays because we are different humans. But I would, for example, take another aspect of the Akbarian. For example, التدبيرات الإلهية of Ibn Arabi is a magisterial political work. It goes to the effect of what I've been talking about for 2 days now. That the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man are actually mirrors of each other, in the sense that man is trying to emulate God's qualities, and God has implanted in man, going to fitra and the vis-a-vis the pessimistic conception of reality, which underlies the constitutional order of the world today. That kind of conception is a precious political conception that comes from the Akbarian tradition that can be utilized healthily, well, and to great benefit in our constitutional thinking today. Why do I have to take everything in Sufism? That's one. As to, I think Mufti Saleh wanted to emphasize the idea of not in, between the commonality. I think I understood you to say the commonality between Shah Waliullah and Taha is that they were not fascinated by the West, so like everyone else, singing the praises of the West and not unable to think outside of that box, which is true. This is precisely one of that is why your question is an excellent one. And my answer to it is, I see it always in such a question is really about a holistic phenomenon, because we are talking about the whole project of Shah Waliullah and the whole project of that Shah Waliullah comes at the end of the classical period, where he is still trained in the old system, where he is still the child of another world, and now he is kind of encroaching on another world, or rather another world is encroaching on his existence, and he's reacting to it. So he is holding on to the tradition and very smartly responding to it. Taha comes with the antithesis. In other words, Taha comes at the end of when the entire encroachment has proven itself to be bankrupt. So he's looking for. There's nothing really to be fascinated about with the modern condition. What do I do? I don't read the future. Nobody knows what is in the future. Our present stinks. What's left? The past. So he goes to the past and he tries to do. This is why his philosophy is different from Shah Waliullah. Because Shah Waliullah was replicating the Sufi Shari'i traditions as a response to imperialism. But Taha has lost that link, because not lost the link, lost the organic link with this. He's not organically trained like Taha. So what he will do, he recreates the Islamic background in a new vocabulary. But both of them are resenting this, and they are not willing to say, okay, although I think Shah Waliullah is more independent than Taha in that sense. Because Taha is still, I think, this is the crux of, the more I think about it, even after the book was published, if this reaches anywhere for the world, I would like him to know that maybe there is a little bit of too much dependence on Western categories and modern categories that we need to liberate ourselves from. And he is the most brilliant man to do the job. As for Anas, again, Anas, you have a knack for asking 10 questions in one. But I'm going to take one aspect of the question, which I think is an important one and relevant for this discussion, which is that how do we do this kind of change that violence is there, and any movement can be subjected to modern violence and crushed. There is something interesting about systems in the world, whether they are biological systems or socially constructed systems, is that every system, including the ones that are in nature, which are the most well designed, that every system has weaknesses and cracks and fissures. That's why we get sick. Because we can allow our system, even the healthiest of us, at one point will get sick. Why? Because of these, precisely these, I call them cracks and fissures in systems. And it is through these, the bad bacteria now is going to be the good bacteria that invades the bad body. And so what I'm suggesting is, it is not a revolution, not violence, because you cannot combat violence with violence and still be who you are. If you shake hands with the devil, you are a devil. So what you need to do is work with consciousness, awareness, as we are doing in this room. If I manage to convince you in this room that something needs to change, now when you go home, start telling your child, don't use these paper towels all the time because there are trees. Use a cloth, wash it, save some trees. And from there you go into why, later on when the child grows, because the world is this and that, according to the story, that the narrative we have been trying to outline here. That's where things begin to change. Once this child is raised with this awareness, they will always be taking it seriously. Anything you feed a child, whether it's food or in reasonable ways, in childhood, it will always stick with them. So this is like a simplified answer to your question, but I think the spirit of it is clear. How long will we be able to tolerate the modern state? I hope not too long. I really don't have an answer for this question. It is just simply wishful thinking. I hope it will not be, but for the modern state to go, we need to change many others. The state is just a name. It is the name from one view of the mountain. We need to change the whole view of our mountain. It is just simply that we see this, but with the state it means what? Capitalism, bureaucracy, and the tyranny of bureaucracy. All of these things that we are going through now, and this epidemic has really shown us how ugly the system can become over nothing. I guess that's it. The issue of Pope Francis. I mean, in my opinion, all religions, when they are interpreted in a healthy way, they share the basics of what I have been talking about. But some religions are much more amenable to this than others. Some religions have to struggle to reach that level, but so I'll stop here.
Thank you very much.
I want also to thank at the end again our host, the President Timothy Giannetti with the American Islamic College for making this such a beautiful and wonderful reception and making us feel so much at home. I want to thank Nizam al-Mulk, Mizan Nizam al-Mulk, for his impressive and almost unequaled sense of initiative. I think there is something in this man that is quite remarkable, beyond remarkable.
MashaAllah.
MashaAllah. God give you health for a long, long time. I want to thank the wonderful audience that has always been, for the past 2 days, most gracious and most wonderful. And of course, an amazing interlocutor. I want to thank you, Mizan, again for choosing him, because I found a treasure. So it's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And just as a final closing, I want to thank you all and invite you all to stay with us, because this is just the beginning now of a whole new chapter of our history as an institution, and hopefully of our history as a community. Because one of the greatest lessons that we constantly remind ourselves here is that Islamic history is really not just about the past; it's what we make. And so we're so happy to be with you and to be partners with you as we do that with God's help and blessings. I want to thank our speakers, thank our scholars for opening our minds and our hearts up. I want to thank the incredible AIC staff that has sacrificed their weekends and their time and their energy to make this possible, including providing lunch for us after this session. And may we continue with God's help and blessings, and may we see each other very soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.